There are a lot of horror games out there on the market today. Many of them are indie games that rely on a lot of silence and sudden jump scares. Some are a resurging revival of resurrected AAA horror that lean a little bit on combat, but try to focus more on tension and suspense for their horror. But there are some that base their fear on the unknown, the weird, the mysterious, and the uncanny, and some still that go for the throat, defying the art of subtlety and going for an abrasive type of fear. These are all effective and valid forms of horror that movies, games, and books have been attempting, perfecting, and failing at for years. And at this point, I don't think it's really any sort of secret that I like my horror to be brooding, psychological, and ambiguous. The layers of storytelling in this type of direction for the horror genre, in my opinion, lead way to some of the most complex and interesting take on horror in general. Not only getting intensely personal and providing an introspective and reflective look back on the human condition, but also having the potential to bury its imagery deep in your mind and make your thoughts unwillingly come back to it time and time again when you least want them, and potentially scar you from the inside over time, which is easily the strongest point in favor towards my enjoyment of this take of horror in general. But coming back to visceral horror, not only being a completely different beast, especially when compared to psychological horror, it has a very difficult task of being anything other than immediately shocking. It tends to lean on the side of reactionary than truly being fear-inducing. For a little example, movies like Saw or Audition provide more disturbing or outright violent and gory imagery to sustain its intensity than it really does rely on being scary. Even bad games in series that I love, like Silent Hill Jump or, in my opinion, fail at being scary or even remotely unsettling simply because of its over-reliance on trying to bombard the player with scary things. And it gets to the point where the horror feels like it's only being held up like a marionette with a crudely drawn face painted on, and it's being flung around by your dad going, Literally the whole point of this video that you're watching right now is me trying to comprehend how a mod for Doom 2, of all things, somehow managed to be both incredibly abrasive in its take on horror, but also so incredibly effective in actually being genuinely scary. So scary, in fact, that my first experience with Total Chaos was at 3 a.m. on a workday because I had randomly woken up and couldn't fall back asleep, so I decided to play a spooky game to keep me occupied in the meantime. But not even halfway through the game's first chapter, I turned it off and couldn't bring myself to reopen it. Now look. I play a lot of those horror games I mentioned previously, and I like a whole lot of them. I've stated this before, but since no one who actually watches my videos actually subscribes to me, like and subscribe, you son of a bitch, I'll repeat a point here. I generally play horror games not necessarily because I get scared by them, but because I like the atmosphere and the general gameplay, which might come across as weird to some people, because a lot of people very much dislike the clunky controls and the abstract puzzles that horror games tend to utilize to balance out and also express the horror. But I need to clarify that it is so genuinely rare for one of them to actually bring such an excessive level of anxiety and genuine fear that the simple fact of being able to do that deserves a video in its own right. So, guess what? That's what I'm doing. Okay, so, how do I say this? Total Chaos is a Doom 2 mod. No, I'm serious.
No, dude, you're full of shit!
Okay, look, I'm serious. Total Chaos is a mod for Doom 2, technically. And I was being honest about that little story about my first experience with the game. I had heard about Total Chaos years ago from a YouTuber named Barley. So being a seeker for spooks, I downloaded the game and very quickly turned into a groveling mess. Time passed, however, and when Pyrocynical uploaded a video recently talking about it, I was flooded with memories of that original experience playing it, and I decided to give it another shot. I distinctly remember saying to myself, I'm sure that I was just exhausted when I first played it. I'm sure it'll be a lot more bearable now. I was both right and very wrong. Total Chaos as a mod is incredible. It is a total conversion mod to the point where I don't even need to explain what that means. You can tell just from looking at it and me saying it. It bears little to absolute zero resemblance to the original engine of Doom 2. It utilizes completely new mechanics, new graphical and lighting effects, and even a Stalker-like environment, being a very Soviet Russia-esque abandoned mining island. It's drenched in damp cold fog, isolated in derelict factories and apartments. One of the absolute highlights of the whole experience is the simple act of just experiencing total chaos. There are so many locations that just radiate atmosphere, but unlike Silent Hill before it, where a lot of its effectiveness at being a horror game is its distinct dichotomy between its horror and its intermittent sections of introspective and lethargic beauty. Total Chaos bears some resemblance to Silent Hill, but honestly comes across like a mixture between Stalker and Doom 3 in terms of its execution and its tone. Now, Stalker and Doom 3 are both games that fall under the horror category, and both of them have varying level of horror and scares. I've never beaten Stalker personally because of its inside-out mechanics that make the game feel so oppressive in its difficulty that it's almost like talking to someone who refuses to say anything to you other than repeating whatever you're saying back to you in a mocking tone. But Stalker really never delves so much in terms of actual horror. Stalker, at least from what I've experienced, feels more like an anxiety attack that took a benzo and is still waiting for the full effects to kick in. Doom 3, however, while being a genuine horror game, sorta, it feels more like a subdued LSD trip that refuses to kick off into the stratosphere. The atmosphere of Total Chaos shines brightest not in its brief, sunlit locations, but contrarily in some of its most dimly lit and derelict locations. Each of the locations that you go through in the abandoned mining town of Fort Frolic, despite mostly being metallic coal mining factories, they all feel pretty distinct from each other, which in and of itself is an accomplishment. The feeling of just being in these locations is often physically overwhelming. They all feel real, and yet supernaturally impossible due to the game's overt, monstrous horror. Entirely derelict, decimated, destroyed, and demolished, the environments radiate the sense of pure isolation. A place lost to some sort of supernatural entity forever until the end of time, tormented by these hideous creatures that will permeate the walls, the air ducts, the grass, the discarded tapestries of Fort Frolic. Each of these creatures encapsulates dread in their own unique ways. Even the standard brute enemies fill you with a sense of dread with their unusually high health and their distinct shuffling sounds that sound like razors on tripwire. The monster variety of Total Chaos is well varied and all equally visually disturbing. The cracking bones of the spider-like enemies as they unfurl their disgusting limbs. Oh, it makes me just want to cringe just thinking about it. Hallways filled with discarded corpses and skulls on spikes that stare at you for only a brief moment before returning their vacant glance back to the gray metallic walls. And in this sense, Total Chaos is similar to Silent Hill, in the way the dungeons of Silent Hill are caked in darkness, hiding potentially unseen horrors. But even in that darkness, the atmosphere of Silent Hill still shines bright. But not the environments, no matter how gruesome or visceral they may appear to be, they are not the thing that makes Total Chaos frightening. It's actually something incredibly simple in concept, but something that benefits horror most out of any genre that I can think of. The sound design. I hinted at this previously while talking briefly about the monsters of Total Chaos, but rarely have I heard sound design this prominent, focused, and oppressive. This simple aspect of the game single-handedly turns the game from a creepy and possible cumbersome experience to a truly frightening and nerve-wracking one. The first half of the game on this playthrough, despite me actually being able to finish it this time, was still a lot for me. I would have to take frequent breaks because after so much time, I just felt drained. Each time I closed the game, I found myself exhaling in relief to be free of the game's isolation. Everything about this game's sound design is expertly and masterfully done. From the constant thumping of your character's heart being ever present in the audio mix, to the stuttering of gates opening and being able to hear the rust scraping alongside the concrete walls they're built into. From the scuttering of monsters to the constant and all-pervading booming ambience of Fort Frolic, there is never a single moment of reflection or solidarity. Even when you are just wandering around the decrepit hallways of Total Chaos, it is on your consciousness at all times, digging its way into your mind always, until after a certain point there was a break in your mental defenses and you feel the sense of urgency. Something like a fight or flight or panic becomes the only thing I can really describe as a parallel. From the start of the first chapter, it is quickly made apparent that the tension of Total Chaos is truly built around the sound design. And it's because of this that all other aspects of the game end up being effective in their attempts at horror. Early on in the game, you were told to flip a few switches to get beyond a sealed gate. On your way to this room, you hear the sound of blowing wind rustling through the open windows, metallic responses to your feet stomping into the ground, and distant sounds of yet unknown terrors. But the thing that makes this meandering walk to the switch room unsettling is this sound. This sound of clanging over and over again off in the distance, as if something just outside your vision is banging against it relentlessly. The perfect rhythm of these clanging noises makes me think of a malevolent force doing it simply to taunt me, to pressure me, trying to get me to stay away, to make me afraid. And to be honest, at least in my case, it works. It will occasionally get louder as you get closer to its potential origin, but never so much to be overbearing over anything else in the sound mix. It's such a subtle yet overbearing little effect that by the time you end up flipping the switches and encounter your first monsters, you're already so on edge that even the basic grunts have you trembling and panicking. And this is the perfect way to open up the game and as a way to introduce yourself to the type of horror that this game is going to be presenting to you. Throughout the rest of Total Chaos, the game uses subtle and not so subtle audio mixing with the sole goal of heightening the tension. And this all comes to a head with the monster designs and the distinct audio cues that each one gives to the player that not only helps indicate a strategy from just simple audio cues alone, but instills a sense of dread in the player simultaneously, which is an incredibly difficult task to manage. The shuffling brutes are goosebump incarnate as you hear them stumbling around corners. The lost souls whisper and their ethereal echoes dance across the hallway as they float towards you. The cancer stomps loudly while being invisible, and you have to exclusively rely on the sounds of their feet to discern their location before they appear out of the fog and attack you. And the widows are possibly the scariest enemies of the game, as the distant shambling of their feet are the only indication of their presence until you turn a corner and see them. The screeching music that swells when you finally lay eyes on them sends chills down my spine every time. And they only move when you do not look at them. There are more, but these are just some very strong examples. Total Chaos is relentless in its unloading of these enemies, and you would think that after a while, the novelty of these types of enemies would start to get a little boring, or that it would lose its momentum of horror. But Total Chaos is shockingly constantly introducing new enemies. And this brings me back to my analysis of different types of horror from the beginning of this video. Total Chaos is a prime example of doing abrasive horror right. Last year, I made a video talking about how Silent Hill 3 is the perfect summer horror game due to its abrasiveness. It felt like the UV rays of the sun on overdrive, but personified it into an oppressive, blood-soaked world that was only driven to hunt you down. Silent Hill 3, despite being blatantly in a horrific town all alone with only your wits to save you a majority of the time, it never felt like true isolation. The characters that you encounter and work with throughout the game always provide a center for that isolation, a reprieve from the game's oppressiveness. You were always under the sight of something in Silent Hill 3, whether it's Claudia, Stanley, Vincent, Douglas, or even Silent Hill itself, there was never a real feeling of pure isolation. Total Chaos is Silent Hill 3's opposite. It is equally as abrasive and oppressive, but despite interacting with someone via radio sporadically throughout the game, there is really no one to turn to talk to. You never see this person's face, and you never speak a word to them. Total Chaos is not only frightening because of its sound design, but because it really does relate a sense of pure isolation. You feel depraved of senses while wandering its hallways. You feel the cold of wind, the patter of water dripping down from broken pipes, the chill of occasional tunnels caked only in darkness, and you only feel the relentless hunt being forced on you. Total Chaos feels like hopelessness. It feels like the barren, brutal, blasé blizzard of winter enveloping you and bringing you nothing. So if you haven't played Total Chaos yet, don't let the fact that this is just a Doom 2 mod deter you from giving it a try. This game, while not incredibly well known right now, has the potential to be a landmark in the indie horror gaming scene, potentially ending up with the likes of Cry of Fear and maybe even Amnesia in terms of impact and being known for one of the scariest games that you can play on the market at any given time. There were so many instances where I said out loud, I just can't take this shit anymore. Which is a hell of a lot more than I can say for a majority of big-name established horror titles. The palpable atmosphere, the relentless, desperate pacing of the monstrous horror, and the subtle psychological aspects that the game occasionally will hint at, coupled with the really well-implemented inventory systems and health managing systems, Total Chaos is an incredible experience and one that you won't forget any time soon.
Tomato is a fruit, but it also a vegetable.